started this morning, so we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Has everybody had a chance to review the minutes? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Unanimous. Public comment. I don't have any names here. Is there anyone here from the public who would like to speak before we get started? Okay, seeing none. We'll go right into the presentations. Our first order of business is the overview of the HART 2015 proposed operating and capital budget. Mr. Stewart.
Good morning. Jeff Stewart, Chief Financial Officer for HART. This morning, we're going to go over the proposed 2015 operating capital budgets. This is the last committee review of the budget prior to the public hearings in September, with the first public hearing on September the 8th at 5:30 in this building. So, briefly, we've had the opportunity to discuss the budget since May. This is the final review, and I want to reiterate exactly what our organizational goals were going into this budget development process. We started in earnest in the February timeframe of this year. Our key goals, as they have been over the last 3 years, is to maintain our current service levels, to ensure that we are keeping the service on the street that we have currently, and then providing enhancements to that service pursuant to the transit development plan that was adopted in 2011 and revised annually since that time. And today we'll be reviewing that annual update to that as well. And of course, we're looking at continuing our long-term fiscal sustainability. We want to start migrating away from our federal reliance on operating costs and moving that back to capital. And then, of course, we want to prepare HART for future growth, whatever growth that may be and look like. We want to be prepared for whatever changes lie ahead. So, key drivers and assumptions to manage. When we start the budget process early in the fiscal year, there are many areas in which we are either concerned with, that we need to really pay attention to and look at, and some assumptions that we have to make early on. A lot of those assumptions don't come to fruition throughout the year. As one example, this year we were very much concerned about the reauthorization and the issues facing us for this fiscal year. Those did not come to light, thankfully, so we were able to budget appropriately on the fiscal formula side. But here are some key drivers and assumptions that we managed through the year. Incremental growth in operating revenues. This will be the second consecutive year that we've seen ad valorem movement. Some other key operating revenues, creating new operating revenues is also a goal. Bus ridership is starting to plateau, although we have seen incredible growth in our ridership over the last 5 years. We are starting to see those numbers start to level out a little bit. Stagnant growth in capital funding. As you'll see as we get into the discussion on the capital budget is less than it was last year, and that is not due to the lack of projects and desire for projects. It's due solely to the lack of available funding for those projects. The federal reauthorization, again, we paid attention to it closely and still are. For FY15's budget, we feel confident that there will not be an issue. The reauthorization in some form will move forward next year. But again, we do keep our eye on Washington. Collective bargaining obligations, they are within the budget this year, but as we move forward to new negotiations in the coming budget years, we have to keep attuned to those needs. And then our non-bargaining staff. We've seen a number of years of no increases, while our bargaining units have seen them. So there's some parity issues that we're trying to address as well, and this budget represents some of those. So to achieve this, as we have done for the last 2 years, the organization goes through a level of service prioritization process. Each of the work units within the organization is directed to look for internal cost decreases and savings. This year we had a target of $500,000 to $1 million. We achieved that goal, and I will get to the specifics of that here in a few minutes. This year, however, we took a different approach to our LOSs. Although they typically are reduction-centered, meaning solely used for cutting money out of the budget, this is the first year that we actually looked at LOSs for increases as well. And we based those on specifically 3 categories. We have a desire of making HART an employer of choice. We want to retain the talent that we have. We want to invest in training for our workforce, not just our operators and mechanics, but our non-bargaining staff as well, to be able to keep them. Addressing the staff workload capacities. Over the last few years, we have reduced non-bargaining staff quite significantly. And we have a lot of staff that are pulling double duty. We combined some jobs. So we want to look at relieving some of that workload in a way of new positions coming up in the next year. The next criteria that we're looking at for LOSs is reinvestment of new revenues. Excuse me. Any new revenues that we receive, we want to look at the best available avenue to reinvest those back into the organization. So as an example, we have the Megabus agreement specifically for MTC use. That's $15,000 a year, and we are reinvesting all of those dollars back into MTC proper. Little things, aesthetics for the operators, for our patrons. In any event, facilities will have available funding that in the past they did not have. Our CNG rebates, we received over $250,000 worth of rebates for this fiscal year alone. Those are all getting reinvested back into our bus replacement program as additional revenues. And our Career Source Tampa Bay, for employees that we put back to work that have been laid off or reduced in force, we get some revenue coming back in that HR is specifically going to use to reinvest back into HART training opportunities. And then forward-thinking programs. We're looking at commuter programs with Tampa Bay employers. Right now we're working with Amazon to see what we can do for that organization as they start to open in the fall. School board fair pilot programs. Over the summer, and this is a recent update over the weekend actually, the school board has gone through some changes as far as their transportation management is concerned. And I was able to touch base with the assistant superintendent over the weekend, and they are still very, very interested in continuing discussions with a pilot. But as we have done over the summer, they want to wait until they fill their transportation management position before pursuing any further discussions, but they are still interested. And once that occurs, we'll pick that discussion back up with them. We have an HCC pilot program, expansion of our retail relationships throughout the region. And then, of course, our smart card e-ticketing opportunities that we'll start looking at next year when we start looking at our smart card fare box technology. So our organizational cost saving measures. Our goal is between $500,000 and $1 million. Through the LOS, the organization saved $1.130 million in reductions internally. And again, this is not level of service on the street, this is level of service within the functional operations of HART. And how are we able to do that? We took a hard look at our vacant positions. We either reduced some vacant positions or retooled those vacant positions. As an example, we took a vacant position within the finance department and moved that over to the planning department, and we recently just hired a new senior planner. So we're reutilizing and reclassing the positions that we have internally. We also looked very hard at our expense categories, the typical ones in administrative service contracts, operational service contracts, reductions in consulting fees, training, travel, consumables, and across the board spending units, spending controls for all operating units. We took a really hard look again at our budget to actuals over the last 2 years. And although we've done a very, very good job over the last 2 years specifically of reducing the amount we budget compared to what we spend, there's still some true-ups that were required, and we were able to get more cost savings out of that. So overall savings, we reinvested back into service, again pursuant to the TDP, which is our starting point every year now for our budget. We were able to add 2.3% increase in service in FY15. Sometime during FY15 in implementation, another 19,000 hours. That's a consecutive year, second consecutive year of service enhancements. Last year we added 1.2 million of service again and 16,000 hours for 8 routes. So again, pursuant to the TDP, we are adhering to our long-range strategic plan as far as status quo and our non-peak service. Also within this budget, we're offering the following key elements. We're maintaining current bus and paratransit service levels, which is our goal. Addition of over 19,000 hours of service to 5 routes. We have bargaining step increases and performance bonuses, both contractual. Non-bargaining cost of living wage adjustments. Addition of new FTEs for increased operational service levels and operational support. An anticipated 12% increase in healthcare costs as part of the budget. And funding for the following activities. Just as we had specific funding last year for some specific projects such as the website and the onboard survey, we have specific projects for this year as well. Our CNG operations and maintenance is funded. One vessel way maintenance and support is funded. The televising of all board of director meetings is included in the budget. A bus rodeo is included in the budget. Upgrades to our operator training materials. Improvements for operator staff recruitment to curb attrition. And improvement for customer service and van operations. And unlike the budget that was presented to you in May of this year, which was very tentative, there is absolutely no use of fund balance again for the 3rd consecutive year in the HART budget.
Excuse me, Ms. Saban.
What is the major driver behind that 12% increase in healthcare costs, Jeff?
Estimated claims activity for next year. It's across the nation, we're seeing anywhere between a 13 to 18% increase in like-sized organizations. 12% is actually right where we would like to be. We would like to be a lot less than that, but 12% is actually less than the national average. We are anticipating a couple of things occurred during this budget year. One, we as an organization have only started being self-insured 2 years ago. So it's a learning process as we move forward, not just on the budget side, but on the claims analysis side. On the budget side, we have done a lot of extensive work, particularly over the last 3 months, on truing up. We have over budgeted extensively on our healthcare over the last few years. And it was more of a fallback or fail-safe, not being self-insured before, and then not having the staff that truly understands how to adequately budget for a self-insured program. So we were able to reduce the amount we budgeted and still absorb the expected claims activity for next year. That's the reason we're looking at around a 12% increase. We originally thought it was going to be about 11, so we were happy to see we were only going up to another percent or so. That's really what's driving it right now, is our anticipated claims activity, our increase of employees for next year. Our number of staff is increasing. I believe we're keeping the majority of, at least the plan now, we're keeping our costs pretty level with the organization for our employees. But as you'll see as we go into the budget, even though we're absorbing what we think will be a 12% increase, the amount of actually additional budgeted funds is not as high as it normally would be, because we had some budgeting changes that we made on how we do it. So even though we look like we may not see a 12% increase in claims activity for next year, the amount of money that we've had to budget for that is actually less than you normally would have to if you were looking at a 12% increase, because of the way we budgeted prior to this year. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does.
Commissioner Beckman?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jeff, what is the amount of reserves that we keep for our insurance fund?
For $5 million.
And that's representative of what percentage of our claims? Yeah, that's 100%.
100%? 100%.
So is that what we usually budget, is about 100%, we budget 100% of claims then per year, or?
Okay.
I guess the question I'm asking is, what is the, how much of our fund do we set aside for reserves for our insurance fund per year?
It's around $5 million a year, and right now, in the past, we have not had an actuarial study for our healthcare. This year, we are getting an actuarial study for the first time to truly give us an anticipated amount of reserves that need to be set forth. In the past, it was our broker that we worked with to anticipate the amount that we need to set aside in our fund balance to be able to prepare ourselves in case the claims overran. So,
Michael Stevens, Chief Business Enterprise Officer. Just to answer your question, we ran about $4.9 million in our claims last year. So that's why Jeff is at that $5 million number, because we're 100% self-insured. If we have about $4.9 million in claims the previous year, you have to have that set aside in the event that there is some issue to make sure that we're able to cover all of our claims and activities. So.
Right. Well, okay, so we got an actuarial that we come in looking at.
yes, sir.
That just seems, typically, I would expect maybe in the future that we probably, that increases a little bit, because usually they be a little bit above your actual claims amount, so it'll be interesting to see what percentage that is.
It may claim, but fortunately, our fund balance is growing, so
Right.
we should be able to absorb that.
And then obviously the employees, I think as you mentioned, they're not, we've not increased any of their premiums or the monthly costs. We're absorbing it as an organization.
And we're still discussing what it will be for next year.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Dr. Martine?
And Jeff, you don't need to answer this today, but if you look at that 12% number, one, is that cost or is that incidence? And I'm assuming we had a 1 to 2% increase in headcount, so the rest of it must be cost. And then of the cost, is it how much is increase in cost for services versus increased in volume of services? Those would be, I think, give us a better picture of what's going on. And maybe a little bit on the demographic profile of the covered population to see if there's any, age and other effects.
And what we've discussed as well is once we get the actuarial study done and prepare for the plan for 15, which begins in January the 1st, we can come back to the board and give an update on our self-insured healthcare plan. All right. So the FY15 proposed operating capital budget combined is balanced at $83,898,391. That's 3.1% under the FY 2014 amended budget, primarily due to the capital budget. The FY 2015 proposed operating budget is $65.8 million, and that's $2.1 million higher than the 14 amended. The FY 15 capital budget is $18,084, which is $4.7 million less than the 14 amended budget. And again, as we discussed the capital side, the budget is very tight for next year. We feel comfortable with what we have on the list of projects to achieve, but we are spending all of the capital funding that we have. We can discuss that a little more once we get to that part. FY15 proposed operating capital budgets, again, bus operations is the largest component. Capital projects, streetcar operations, and paratransit operations. Streetcar operations is staying relatively flat. There will be a needed infusion from the city of Tampa to balance the THS budget this year. We are going forward on Wednesday to the THS board to discuss that proposed budget one last time prior to the city of Tampa adoption. Discussions have already been held with the city of Tampa, and they are aware, and it is included in their proposed budget for FY 2015 as well. Revenues. Revenues are projected at a total of $66.8 million, with expenditures totaling $65. It is planned that we have $1.013 million, excuse me, at the end of FY15 drop to fund balance. For FY 2014, we're anticipating right around $900,000 to be dropped to the bottom line. And last year, we achieved our KPI at 0.5% of the prior year's fund balance being dropped. At the end of the year, we were able to achieve that by 400% over what that KPI indicates. So for the last 3 years, including this coming fiscal 15, we'll have almost $3 million that will have dropped to the bottom line to fund balance support and improving our fiscal sustainability. Our property taxes, again, remain our highest component of our operating revenue. $2.1 million more than FY15, thanks to some pretty good property valuation increases over the last year. It's based on a millage rate of 0.5, which the board tentatively adopted in July of this year. Fair passes, fares and passes, as you can see, this starts to show the amount of ridership that's starting to plateau. And again, this does not include, there's an action item today before you, of keeping the fares and pass flat, or what they are today without increasing, a resolution keeping that in place. So this does not include any fare increase, although in the fiscal plan that you're going to see here towards the end of the presentation, every 2 years we do anticipate an increase in fares. But again, every 2 years we'll come back to the board and discuss the viability of doing that. Our millage history says FY11, we have stayed, or FY12 has been at the maximum charter at 0.5. In our fiscal plan and our strategic fiscal plan for the next 5 years, and then with the next 10 years, with the TDP, we're anticipating keeping that at 0.5. Again, that's a board decision, but for modeling purposes, we will err on the side of maximum levy. A slide that you are familiar with has shown our comparisons between ridership and property tax revenue. We are starting now to look like where we were right around the FY06 as far as property tax revenue is concerned. As you see, again, our ridership is starting to plateau over the last 2 years. We will continue to monitor this and update this as we move forward with our strategic planning process. Expenditures. Operating expenditure overview, employee costs, again, and most governmental organizations experience the same statistic. Employee costs are the highest component of our operating expenditures. Fuels, materials, and supplies, purchase services, and other expenses making up the complete piece of that $65.8 million expenditure item, and we'll get into the employee costs, exactly what is driving those. Salary and fringe benefit expenditures are estimated to be $1.1 million higher than FY 2014. The salary increase of $1,080,000 is attributable to, we added 18.87 positions into fiscal year 2015's budget. Those are operators, those are mechanics, those are key operating positions to be able to start to level the workload that we discussed earlier in the presentation. Non-bargaining wage increases of $231,000 is a 3% across the board cost of living adjustment for all non-bargaining employees. Step increases for Teamster bargaining unit, and contractual performance bonuses and step increases for our ATU employees of $212,000. Fringe benefit increase of $48,000 is attributable to, now again, the cost only went up $48,000, and that was primarily due to the fact that we added employees. That shows how much we have over budgeted healthcare in the last 2 years. And we worked very, very hard collectively and come to an agreement of exactly what that amount should be going into next year, and we feel pretty comfortable with that amount. We restructured the way that the accounting for the healthcare internally. We are going to start a process this year that actually starts a healthcare fund balance, meaning for the money that is over collected and not necessarily spent for healthcare for the current budget year will drop to a healthcare fund balance, as many governmental entities do. We would have the opportunity then for the subsequent year to apply that additional money to pay down any increases in healthcare, either on the employee side or the employer side each year. In organizations I've been a part of in the past, we were able to buy down incremental increases to employee costs that would have negated any increase in salary that they received for that year. So we have the ability going into the future to have a fund balance, which one could help buy down the cost, or two, help fund the reserve that the actuarial sets up.
Excuse me, Commissioner Becker.
Thank you. What have we done as far as, or are we doing anything as far as wellness programs for our employees to look at long-term cost containment?
We are.
We have an extensive wellness program. We do at least 2 large wellness programs a year. That's just for the purposes of educating and engaging our employee population. But through the entire year, we program probably 4 or 5 significant wellness activities. In fact, one of the most recent ones we have right now is one that's called Mission Slim Possible. And that is to address, our weight issues and all those issues that are driven by weight. Hypertension, diabetes, those types of things. We've seen a tremendous turnout by our employee base for our wellness activity programs. In fact, our human resources manager, Darryl Schinneberg, is here, and she's far more involved in the wellness program. She and her team, we have next year in our healthcare budget, we have $50,000 set aside from Cigna, who is our healthcare administrator, for wellness specifically, just to continue to drive those cost savings and that value from our wellness programs.
I would just be interested on a side note, if you all, because we're doing the same thing in the county, evaluating our health and wellness programs. If you might be able to give me a summary of all the things that we're doing and how that might impact our costs, our healthcare plan, I'd be interested.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Actually, while we're on the subject, I had a question. Do we have any like catastrophic protection for ourselves if our claims were to go unusually high, since we're not here to back?
We do. We have a stop loss in place, so anything over $150,000, dollar one over $150,000, that stop loss policy kicks in, and then that shifts the risk to our reinsurer. So we absolutely had that. We've had it since the inception of our self-funded program, because you just never know what's coming down the pipe. Needless to say, since we've had it, it's actually paid for itself. We have had a few catastrophic claims where that's had to kick in, and we have gotten significant savings as a result of that risk being shifted over to our reinsurer.
And then one other question I had was in the area of wellness programs. Do we have any type of telemedicine programs, or have we ever investigated telemedicine? I see you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Dara to step up. She's the SME on that one. So Dara, if you will, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Member George. Yes, we have investigated the option of doing some telemedicine through several vendors that we've been liaising with, one of which is Compass Medicine, which is a concierge program, and it does provide those services. However, what we have found is that with our TPA and healthcare provider, Cigna, we have significant outreach efforts going on telephonically, by the internet. People can download the mycigna.com app. We absolutely encourage that, and we've seen a tremendous increase in the number of contacts with our employee population, just using the services that are provided by virtue of the amounts we already paid to our TPA. But that is an excellent suggestion, and we're still evaluating that as an option. Thank you very much.
Other fringe benefit costs. Each year we receive a gift from the state of Florida in the way of an FRS mandatory increase. This year was no different. It was an increase of over $200,000 of mandated rate increases by the state of Florida. But again, by restructuring the way that we account for and budget for our health care, we were able to absorb many of those costs with little to no impact to the overall budget for next year. Fuel and oil, we have a net increase of $140,000. As you may recall, the plan for the next 3 to 4 years, we will be running diesel vehicles as well as compressed natural gas vehicles concurrently until our entire fleet gets replaced with CNG vehicles. So each year there will be an incremental increase due to one, the replacement program that we are able to afford for our vehicles and still running parallel. We do have good news to report though going into next year. We have already locked, I think, 6 months worth of fuel costs going into next year with our fuel contract, and we have locked a low budget. So we're very excited about the work that our procurement staff has done and getting those fuel numbers locked. Administrative services, we have a net decrease of $227,000. Again, last year, as you may recall, we had a series of projects. They were one-time projects, such as the website development, the on-board survey. Those projects are completed, so they were one-time events, so they didn't get rebudgeted. And a lot of things didn't necessarily fill their space. That's part of our new budgeting process of not just taking what was budgeted last year and putting it forward this year. We were able to reduce in some areas such as human resource screening cost reductions. Again, historically we've spent or budgeted X number of dollars and I've only spent Y number of dollars. So we have adjusted that accordingly. Our HART website upgrade expense reduction, onboard passenger survey, and threat vulnerability study and transit waste study is all completed over last year. So we were able to reduce that specific line item. Our position breakdown, by our number of employees for next year, ATU making up 78.4%, Teamsters 5.9%, and non-bargaining at 15.7%. All right, a 5-year look ahead. Now, a couple of things, and the importance of this model today is you're going to see this model in the next presentation as well, the TDP, that is expanded out 10 years. What we wanted to do, and this has become our process at HART, making sure that the decisions that we're making today, we're really truly analyzing those long-term impacts of sustainable operations. So the 5-year look ahead, again in FY15, we're looking at $1.013 million dropping to the bottom line. FY16, we're looking at just a little bit over 141 being dropped to fund balance, and then we start into the red, going up from 17 to 19. Again, just as we discussed, every fiscal year, we feel confident that through a series of continued LOSs and reviews of our TDP enhancements that we will be able to mitigate those costs and come back with a balanced budget for the board. Now, what this 5-year look ahead does include, it includes all of the transit development plan status quo enhancements that you're going to see today in that proposed plan. It does include all increases in wages and operating costs for those routes. It takes into account a conservative approach to our revenues for the next 5 years. We're looking at a 4% growth rate on ad valorem. Fare revenue increases, reflects increases every 2 years. And again, we discussed that earlier. We'll come back to you and discuss that in FY16. We begin our formula calibration in 16. I'll bring your attention to the formula line. As you can see, between FY14 at 10.6, FY19 at 6.8, that doesn't mean that we are anticipating less formula. It means that we are anticipating putting less formula into the operating budget and allowing that money to go back into our capital program, which you'll see in a few minutes is very needed. And again, this 5-year look ahead represents the transit development plan. So what does this 5-year look ahead do? It's for the second consecutive year of building reserves while we are enhancing service. Provides for $1 million of cost savings. Adds 19,000 hours of enhancements in FY15. Addresses employee needs, bargaining step, performance bonuses, and non-bargaining increases. And funding of new positions and needed new projects. All our capital budget. As I mentioned in May, you'll notice a large piece of this pie is very different from the pie that you saw last year and the year before. And that's due to the fact that the county CIT funding has been spent and returned. Those projects are completed and they are no longer part of this capital program. So federal grants make up $16.7 million worth of our capital revenues. The majority of that is for vehicle purchases and a very small part of our formula. Capital expenditures, again, that's $16.7 million in grant funding, federal grant funding. The majority of it's going to vehicle replacement. We have facilities and construction costs, transit infrastructure, which is our BTI program, and support functions and equipment. It's $4.7 million less than last year. So why is it less? Solely because of revenue. We've had very strong and long discussions in the organization of the capital needs moving forward over the next 2 years. And we have a lot of unfunded projects. We are spending the federal revenues that we receive for capital and planning to spend them in the next year. We will continue to do that, and as new revenue opportunities come up or discovered, we will insert those and add projects to the capital list through the amendment process. Specifically for next year, we've applied for the Tiger Grant. We've applied for the Ladders of Opportunity Grant Program, we've asked for $24 million for fleet replacement to CNG. So hopefully some of those will come to fruition, even in small pieces. We will be happy to receive those. FY15 proposed capital budget, and I won't go through all of these. I'll highlight a couple of noteworthy projects. Our bus and van replacement and maintenance program, and something called Bus Service Life Extension Program, something new to the capital budget this year. I'm going to try to say the acronym, but somehow it doesn't come out right. The Bus Service Life Extension Program is a project developed by our operations folks to sustain the life of buses that have exceeded their useful life. Why are we doing that? Our bus replacement program is sorely underfunded. And for us to be able to maintain this current service on the streets, as well as the enhanced service within the TDP, it is necessary to pull these buses and extend their life. So we have a $600,000 line item this year, another $650,000 next year, planned in 16 to be able to buy new engines and new transmissions outside of the normal transmission and engine replacement cycle. So that's a very, very important program that we started this year to extend the life of those buses. Our fare collection system, still moving forward for next year. We discovered this year that although we have spent a lot of money on the CNG renovations to the heavy maintenance facility, and we are getting ready to do ADA compliant renovations, we have a roof that leaks. So we are going to invest some of the money for next year into not only a roof for the HM building, but for the PM building as well. That was not on last year's plan. The 21st Avenue facility stormwater engineering assessment, very important to get done next year, have a firm come out and do a true assessment of all of our stormwater issues that we have at our 21st facility to prevent the flooding that we continue to see even over this summer. So the interim CEO's recommended proposed FY15 budget. Operating expenditures of $65.8 million, capital expenditures of $18.084, estimated $1 million of additional revenue over expenditures to fund balance at year end. And again, we were able to save internal costs, add service hours, funding of new positions, and our continued emphasis on out-year fiscal sustainability. Our next steps, September the 8th, the first public hearing at 5:30, second public hearing on September 22nd, where the budget will be adopted. And then the fiscal year begins, and we start work on the FY16 shortly thereafter. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you. Are there any questions from board members? Wow. Ms. Egan? Questions and comments?
Yeah, I don't want to jump in if there's no questions, but one thing you will notice, oh, Dr. Corzine has a question on.
Quick question, Jeff. As I understand it, we're tracking this year on miles of service relative to last year, about 2% over last year, is that correct?
That's correct.
Close to that? And on ridership, we're 1.6, 1.
Depends on the month, we are coming at, ranges from about 1.5% to 3%, but I'll get with, yeah, year to date, I'll get with everything, you guys to get the exact number for us.
My recollection is, and I tend to watch that fairly closely. Are you expanding service faster than ridership or vice versa? And that ultimately influences productivity. The good news we've had is we've had a decade where, atypical in the industry, we've been growing demand faster than supply. And we need to be careful about that as agencies expand. It's not uncommon to grow supply 2, 3, 4, 5 times faster than demand, but when you do that, you impact productivity. So I pay close attention to those anyway.
As we do the major, so this is a small update for the TDP. Of course, next year is a major update. We'll be coming back, not just to the vision plan, but the status quo plan. There are definitely projects in the outlying years, and as we see where services going now, there are just things that we don't think would make sense to cancel. Not just looking at a future schedule change now, but coming back with a more global view on that in the next TDP update.
That leads me to a question on our TDP. How much of it is being taken out by the county for their units?
As I understand, the entire transit, the road entire transit projects should be based on our TDP. The information we've given them is in the vision plan and the status quo plan as adopted by this board, and that's what they have rolled in. So as they are doing the transit involvement, it should be our TDP, and to the extent that we will be supporting going out to these meetings, it will be completely focused on what the transit information looks like, where the investments go. Again, we'll come to next year's big update on the TDP. We're looking at this as a good opportunity to start the public involvement.
But my question is, all this list of projects that the county's taking out, does it include our entire TDP?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Now, every year, TDP doesn't have the fixed guidelines, so anything that is full BRT or beyond that is completely within the county's area where they're looking at those projects, since that's not in our TDP.
But I want to make sure
Yes,
our
ma'am.
entire project list is going up, because it is interrelated.
Yes, ma'am.
It's not just shotgun projects.
I actually did have one quick question. When you talked about that we hired a new senior planner, and I did see that in the Friday's meeting, how does that relate to our July 21st board meeting when we were seeking $500,000 from the county? Is that included in that 500? How does that
It
work?
was separate from that. And thank you for the question. The current planning service that we have is mid to short range, so, excuse me, 3 to 5 years in horizon. Of course, we do the TDP, but we really focus on where the planning of our service goes out there. And our current staffing has a senior manager of service planning, in the ITS group of the schedulers, so we have not had a planning resource separate from that. The recommendation to add the planner was reflecting that between the NPO, county meetings, to BARDA meetings, various stakeholder meetings, our manager of planning is doing data compliance, and he's running around to every meeting. And he doesn't have the ability to step back and look at where service is and do some of the more in-depth information and in-depth studies that Dr. Corzine is talking about. So what we brought on is a senior planner to make sure our mid-range and our short-term stuff is meeting demand out there. The July 21st vote would have been more systems planning, a longer range of saying, if you were going to go to the step above your TDP vision plan, what does that look like? How do those costs come back together? What does the ridership look like? Does what's being proposed make sense rolling in the community outreach? So we will continue to use a senior planner regardless of if anybody funds that $500,000 request. It's a long-term investment for us.
Thank you. Okay, any more questions or comments? Thank you. We will move back into the overview of the 2015 to 2024 TDP annual update. And again, Mr. Seward.
Good morning. Each year, we are required by state administrative code to update our transit development plan. This will be another annual update, and I'll go through it as quickly as possible.
What happens if you don't follow?
TDP update.
Yeah, you send it into the state, what happens if you don't
State block
follow?
grant money.
Hmm?
You lose state block grant money.
Oh, well, I think we better advise our county people of that. No, serious.
No, good point. We, excuse me, I'll turn my microphone back on. We've been spending a lot of time with county staff, specifically planning and public works, essentially educating them on the rules which we have to follow for transit planning. That if the FTA, for instance, supports a project like a ferry dock, that ferry will operate the entire useful life, similar to what's going on with streetcars. 30-year investment, you run it for 30 years. And this is a good point for us to make sure that we're educating them on that following the TDP means that's where the state money is attached to that.
Mr. Stewart.
All right, the TDP, it's the 10-year business plan for HART. As we just discussed, it's mandated by the state of Florida Department of Transportation through administrative code, and all transit agencies in the state of Florida, and also those transit departments of counties or cities are also required to maintain eligibility for their state block grant funding. For us, it's right around $4.2 to $4.3 million per year, and helps fund bus operator salaries and benefits for specific routes in our region. We have a major update every 5 years with an annual abbreviated update. Our last formal update was in 2011, and we'll be looking at a full-blown update in 2016. We will be working on a solicitation next year for a firm to come in and help us with that plan. So as you may recall, last year we took a different approach to the annual update of the TDP, and it was a pretty expansive review and revision of what was originally established in 2011. And we look at it as a fresh and realistic perspective to what HART is capable of doing with the status quo and what we would really like to see in the vision plan. A couple of things that we did with that revision is take into account the realities of current community discussions. Last year, a lot of those discussions were still in their infancy. This year, I would argue that many of those discussions have matured in some way. They're still out there, but they didn't necessarily become tangible enough to change our TDP. So we're keeping with the plan that we had last year and expanding upon it. One of the key differences of our TDP annual update that we've started to do is the coupling of it with the budget process. FY15, we kept to what we told the board last year, that the TDP would be the starting point for the annual budget, and indeed for FY15 planning it was. We started with what we said we were going to do in the TDP, to see if it was still viable, both service-related, ridership, as well as funding availability, and work from there. So the budget you see today that is going to the public hearings next month actually represents an unchanged TDP that was adopted last year. So we feel very good with the process. Looking at an emphasis on regionalism, looking at where we can connect and cooperate with our partners within the region. And then really looking at what the growth of ridership means to us, or the plateauing of ridership, particularly to the status quo. And then the genesis of the current TDP, knowing where that TDP was originally generated from, and the basis for planning at that time 5 years ago, we wanted to take a fresh approach, and we did. So that's the foundation of the TDP that you're going to see before you today. Now, although we're keeping the theme of last year, we're not keeping the expansiveness of last year. This TDP update is meeting the requirements, the minimal requirements that state administrative code requires of each of the transit agencies. We feel pretty comfortable with the planning that has been done for this TDP, that we're happy with the extent of this update. Specific sections required. It's necessary to discuss past year's accomplishments, analysis of any discrepancies between the plan and what you're performing, any revisions to the implementation program for the coming year, revised implementation program for the 10th year, added recommendations for the new 10th year, a revised financial plan, and a revised list of projects and services needed to meet the goals or objectives. And the majority of those projects are unfunded. We'll get to that in just a second. So the original TDP goals established in FY11 modified by the HART Board in 2012 and 2013. FY 2014 marked the first year since 2007 that service revisions centered on enhancements of service versus elimination and reinvestments of current service. So last year's TDP and this year's TDP, the first time since 2007 where a TDP didn't have service reductions inserted in it. We feel very good about that. FY14 also marked the first year the TDP was tied to the budget process. Our increased fare box recovery went from 24 to 25.6%. We received over $5.8 million of new grant funding and applied for over $25 million of additional grant funding. Through new or enhanced revenue opportunities, received over $900,000 of additional revenue and completed ADA improvements to 40 stops. So those are accomplishments for last year's TDP compared to what we thought we were going to have during that same period of time.
Mr. Stewart, if I could interject or make a comment or a question here. You say this was the first year that the TDP was tied to the budget development process. Do you feel like that aided your determining the budget this year? Did it help in any way? Did it detract in any way?
Absolutely helped on a couple of fronts. First, the process that the organization followed in prior years was that the budget office or the finance department would tell service planning how much money they had. You have $5 million for new service for next year or whatever that amount is. They work towards a number where now it's based mission driven. Here's why we're here. We're here to provide services to the citizens of Hillsborough County. Here are the routes that need enhancements. We have standing room only issues. We have timing issues. You come back to us now with the need and we'll work it through the budget process. So it's putting a service-centric approach to our budget planning, which it really should be anyway. So it absolutely helped. We've actually had comments from other transit agencies as well as TBART and FDOT saying that they are very pleased with that approach and process, as we are one of the only transit agencies that they could name that is actually tying the transit development plan to their annual budgeting process. So they should be coupled, and we have found it absolutely advantageous of being able to provide the service that we need to. Past year's accomplishments compared to the original implementation, specific goals that have been completed. Completed and opened our Metro Rapid North-South, completed our Metro Rapid East-West PD&E and 30% design. We opened our Yukon Park and Ride and our CNG fueling station. Ridership has increased 1.5% in the first half of 2014. For the period 2009 through FY13, ridership increased 25.8%, with average weekday ridership exceeding 50,000. We deployed our One Bus Away application and initiated HART's first environmental sustainability program. So again, these are accomplishments compared to what we originally thought we would achieve during that period of time. This is actually my favorite part of the TDP. Any discrepancies between the plan and its implementation past year? We have no major discrepancies noted. So last year, we put forth a series of objectives and targets for this year's TDP to achieve, and we have achieved those with no discrepancies. Any revisions to the implementation program for the coming year? The following capital projects were, one, included in the adopted TDP for 14, but are being programmed in 15 for initiation, either due to lack of funding during that period of time or lack of resources to be able to complete those projects. Or two, not included in the adopted TDP and added as a new element in the FY15. The 21st Avenue Maintenance Building, EBOR facility, stormwater engineering assessment, HMPM roofs, and the facility maintenance equipment, which is replacing a lot asset equipment throughout our facilities. These are new projects that weren't in the original TDP that we're adding into 15. And I won't go through each of these. These are all included in the primary document. We have the following service elements have been added, deleted, or changed for the coming year. And again, all of these are reflected in the FY 2015 budget that you just saw. The major deletions were in the vision plan. If you recall last year when we presented that annual update, we included Plant City expansion and the discussion of including Plant City both in the revenue, on the revenue side and on the expenditure side. Through discussions for this update, we have removed all Plant City expenditures and expansions in the vision plan. So those are the major deletions for next year. The original TDP's 10th year was FY 2012. The new 10th year is 2024. So pursuant to administrative code, you consistently have to go back to the original 10th year and amend it appropriately. So for FY 21 status quo plan, we have multiple new routes. Again, it's in the primary document. But again, this is some ways out. We know that the TDP will most likely change throughout the process. New 10th year, 2024, revision of original 10th year, 2021 on the vision side. This also includes, the one key component of this TDP is its bus-centric approach and its expansion, just as we presented last year on our new Metro Rapids. 6 new Metro Rapids are included, and the final 6 Metro Rapids would be in this final year, the Brandon to downtown Metro Rapid. The new 10th year of the TDP, again, is 2024. And again, the final year of the TDP is a product of all prior years of that TDP. So everything happens to happen with a domino effect. In any event, the state requires you to focus on that final 10th year, and this is what we have provided as far as planning is concerned for 2024. 6 local routes extended to 24 hours on weekdays, that's in the status quo. Our vision plan includes all status quo plan enhancements. 2 local routes, 2 express routes expanded, a new Metro Rapids, 6 flex routes, and again, years 1 through 9 support that final 10th year. So any changes to those years 1 through 9 obviously will have an effect on that final 10th year. So the plans themselves, the revised status quo, it includes current service levels and non-peak enhancements. Is supported by projected fare increases, which I discussed during the budget presentation, increased ridership projections, and growth in ad valorem. As revenue allows, additional non-peak service enhancements can be added. Now, again, tying the budget to the TDP process, it allows us the opportunity that if we do receive more revenue and there are additional enhancements that we would like to see that the status quo TDP does not contain, we have the opportunity to change the TDP during this process to reflect what we budgeted. So that's another benefit of coupling them together. It also includes several plan technological enhancements. The 10-year plan includes a complete swap out of our diesel vehicles to CNG and our regional fare boxes. It does not include, again, any additional peak service or route expansion, or in other words, any expansion or enhancement that requires a new additional bus is not included in the status quo. And again, this drives our annual budget development process. And as an example, I just pulled one of the graphics out for FY15. So for FY15, and again, this is what is included in the 15 budget that you saw earlier. No additional buses, 1.9 million additional total miles over the 10 years, 142,000 additional total hours of service, 1.2 million additional estimated passengers over the 10-year status quo plan. The graphic you see up there is for 15, which is in the budget. Obviously, we didn't have 1.9 million new miles of service for next year. So again, over the 10-year period of the status quo, those are the key elements. The revised vision plan, and again, this is the vision plan from the TDP. Includes additional new service levels with required supporting capital projects. Again, it's a bus-centric approach with expansion of 6 Metro Rapid BRT routes. Focus on the routes that support the community discussions that are ongoing, including key population and employment centers. Exclude last year's hypothetical planned city service, additional local peak express. Although more realistic and meets prioritization, it continues to be an unfunded plan. It also does not include any discussions, just as we discussed last year, with the streetcar, no expansion with the streetcar, no light rail alternatives, and it does not include the ferry. It re-emphasizes a key bottleneck to any future expansion that we discussed last year, and that's the requirement of a new bus maintenance facility as well as moving our paratransit operations due to our limitations at our current 21st Avenue facility. Those are 2 key dominoes that have to drop for any expansion past the East-West Metro Rapid BRT. Again, this is being used to provide a foundation for any future planning. Once this plan is approved by the state of Florida, we will provide it to the county as our updated GDP. All vision plan capital requirements are now included in the HART annual budget, but unfunded. And as funding becomes available, vision components become status quo for budgeting purposes. So if a hypothetical vision route is needed and there's discussion that it needs to be included, we will move that into the status quo and it becomes a status quo element from that point forward. Our revised vision plan, and again, the vision plan adds another 10th year. Over 35 local and express routes enhanced, 9 new express routes, 6 additional Metro Rapids, 3 new flex routes, 11 new local routes, including circulators, 848,000 new service hours, an estimated additional 11.7 million passengers over the 10-year period. But it does require 185 new buses and 15 new flex vans, and again, those 2 bottlenecks, the additional 2 new facilities.
What does that take the fleet size up to in that scenario?
At the end of the vision plan, Dr. Wilson?
Yeah.
For some reason, I'm thinking 380 vehicles, but let's get the exact number out and do it today.
Yeah, the 185 was net new,
Yeah, then you can also see how much we've got for the flex vans and presumed a multiplier for paratransit as well. So we'll do that today.
Now, with the revised financial plan that's required by the state administrative code, something that we were going to do last year, but we did not actually have time to do it, was to incorporate the 5-year strategic financial plan and couple it into the TDP as a 10-year financial plan. So this year we were able to do that. And again, the format you are familiar with. So what we've taken is a status quo plan and expanded it out 10 years with our financial plan. And it's the same process with the bottom line red deficits that you see out for the 10th year. So as an example, in FY 2024, based on the status quo plan that you're seeing today, we have a $14.4 million deficit to be able to support that status quo. Typically with this model, I'm very comfortable with saying we have lots of ways to mitigate these deficits. And I will only say that for the first 5 years. I won't go any further than that, as the status quo plan will change. There are many, many variables in here, but again, I wanted to start showing it in a format that we use for our long-range strategic financial planning to couple it and make it one. Primarily, the status quo, the deficits are based on our availability of funding, since no new buses are required. It also requires capital needs
Consideration that we have done in regards to the circulator routes for the TDP.
And Councilman, it depends on, it sounds really off to your project, doesn't it? It depends on the particular circulator. Some of these are backed up by MPO studies, for instance, the South Shore circulator. Some of these are tied to previous studies such as flex expansion. Others are areas which we have identified for service expansion in the future, and as we get closer to those windows, we do more in-depth review. But we make some general, general decisions based on population density, requests for service, what the rest of the network looks like that's in the area, and then relying on that information, we start identifying the areas. So we've got some basic service plan that gives into just even including anything within the TDP vision plan. But as we get closer, one flex zone would be smaller, in-house review, more robust or expansive networks like the South Shore Circulator would be something we partner with the MPO to get a full study done before we slot it into implementation.
Any other location?
I believe we've got Temple Terrace, we've got expansion for flex in New Tampa. At the end of the TDP, the 10-year vision window, we have a bunch of areas identified. We can go ahead and pull those lists and send those out with the full information later today, and just wait for the plan to go up there.
And the updated status quo capital plan. And I only took the 5 years, just in this, it's in the actual document. The deficits here, you see capital vehicle replacement. That is the real capital expense required to maintain the status quo, is being able to maintain our fleet replacement program. Now, although the fleet replacement program is in a deficit each year, we are managing our ability to be able to keep the buses extended past their useful life, to their useful life, and maintain. So we are able to keep up with the current status quo requirements. Again, we requested $24 million in ladders of opportunity. We will continue to reinvest our CNG rebates back into the bus replacement program. And we'll also be looking at some possible ways to do some financing for our buses in the future that we'll be bringing back to you over the next year.
A question, you mentioned that part of the status quo was replacing the CNG buses. At the end of the 10-year TDP window, what percentage will we be at completing that conversion? I would imagine it would be almost complete.
Either fully or a handful of
100%, yes.
It should be 100% complete
Yes.
at the end of the window. Okay.
And again, as an example, if we were able to receive the entire ladders of opportunity grant, which is a stretch, but hypothetically, we would be able to bump up some of those out-year replacements and do them much sooner. So again, it's solely based on the availability of funding. Our vision plan, revised financial plan, again, using the same formula or same format. On the top part of this graphic, you'll see the status quo. Since the vision plan encompasses all of the status quo plans as well, it's simply an add-on to the status quo. And again, with the vision plan, you see the vision plan, and this is the operating shortfall, again through FY19. Again, I only showed 5 years on this graphic, but just in the first 5 years, if we were to start implementing in 15, we would go all the way up to a $16 million deficit starting in 19. But we all know that, and that's why those elements are in the vision plan and not in the status quo plan. In the capital, in the vision plan capital, you see a total deficit. I believe the original capital deficit for our vision plan that had been reported and discussed at the county conversations was $400 million. This added and added 10th year and revised overall 10-year vision plan takes that amount up to $464 million. So it's still within that $400 million range of capital needs to support HART's TDP vision plan. A revised list of projects or services needed to meet the goals and objectives for which funding have not been identified. It has to be included in the TDP as well. This is unchanged from last year. It's the same series of projects. You see the 6 BRTs that are there and necessary funding requirements. Our paratransit flex facility and the maintenance facility. 21st Avenue maintenance renovation to be able to support additional fleet. Operations technology to support all of the ongoing expansion. And again, this will be included in the TDP and in the HART annual budget as unfunded. So, next steps. Actually, the draft TDP went to FDOT on Friday afternoon. We asked them to look at the TDP to provide any feedback, any questions and concerns prior to going to the full board. We did this last year, and it proved beneficial. We were able to make some adjustments prior to the board approving it. Finalize the draft TDP. There's still some issues with the formatting and some contextual issues we want to change. We will present to the full board at the September 8th public hearing for comment, recommended changes, or consideration for approval. If there are changes or recommendations to that TDP on the 8th, we will come back on the 22nd public hearing with those changes and ask for adoption of the final TDP annual update. And submit official documentation to FDOT in September following one of the public hearings, whichever it gets adopted in. And then what we will start doing, we will have one more annual update prior to the full update in 16. And we will be working on an RFP for next year to get a consultant in to help us with the full re-engineer TDP. And that concludes my presentation.
Any questions from board members? Dr. Cuisine?
This is slightly beyond the TDP, Jeff and Catherine's question on, is there a critical path defined in terms of deploying, if we're in a position to expand service more rapidly because there's new money available? What would be the sequence of steps and how quickly could we have new peak period service out? If you define, how many more buses you could squeeze into the existing facility and how long it would take to have a second. Have we done any of that kind of logistics type planning to know how fast we could ramp up?
Thank you. Yes, we have. Under the current state contract, it takes us about 18 months to get a new 40-foot vehicle in our hands, as it were. So if the check were cut today, or the funding were made available for the procurement process, we'd be looking at February of 2016 to be able to have a new 40-foot vehicle on the road. Vans obviously have a faster procurement cycle for us, closer to 6 months. So that would be the first step. We anticipate about 10 more full-size vehicles over 21st before it's completely full, or some combination of essentially no 2 vans going in for each bus space that we lose. So the next step on that would be, how quickly could we go out and locate a van facility? Our recommendation would go to a van facility first. And realistically, it's not just having the money for the vans, it's having $30 to $40 million to purchase an another facility to get going forward. And at that point, based on market research, probably 2 to 3 years from the time that we have money in hand, we could hit the street to say, where's this new location going to, all the work that we can operate.
I think that it would be important to define that, and I think in addition to that, and that those aren't real different than I would have expected, but I think the prospect of is there a privatization option that could facilitate a quicker response that needs to be on the table for discussion as well.
Yes, and that actually is information that the county asked during the development of their proposal, was how quickly could you go out to contract out of service under 13C. If it's new and something we don't provide today, we do have the opportunity to contract out. And I would refer that to our fantastic procurement team that can move pretty quickly. And it's closer to a 6 to 9 month window if we start today hitting the street for an RFP and then go through the evaluation and award process to get another vendor in to provide our service.
And they need vehicles too, and they've got lead times too, and so, we need to understand what all at once.
Correct, and the difference between a local vendor that would have to purchase vehicles versus a national vendor who might have access to a fleet that they could rotate in, that would change the timeline as well.
Anybody else have a comment? Because I would just like to make the comment about the TDP in general. Well, first off, this is really our first look at it, because I don't think it had been made available, but seeing that there's not any major changes, that's totally understandable. But I did want to bring up the fact that the vision plan still does include the Metro Rapids, and tie that into the report that came out from the county in May, which was an assessment of transit, which I think we were emailed a copy of. I did request
that we print out that ACOM study so that we can all look at it, not here in this meeting, but just if you had not had a chance to look at that, I wanted to have that available. But the reason I think this is important is because the number one recommendation was that to improve transit, we needed to build ridership, and that the metro ramp was one of the best ways to go. So it really did strengthen the position that we have in the TDP. So this isn't coming from HART, this was my request, but you know, in your leisure, if you feel so inclined, it might be a really good look at the path that we're proceeding here in the TDP. Thank you. I guess, and Jeff, you mentioned that the TDP doesn't include the ferry. We met with FTA last week, and just a quick update on the ferry project. We are, as I correct me more and wrong, the grant itself is currently in the pre-award status. And can you walk us through what that actually means for us?
Sure. Although we know that we call it awarded, we're only in the pre-award stage. That means there are a series of requirements that have to be met prior to us entering into the federal information system, that we have met those requirements and can accept and actually start spending money against that agreement. The key element that needs to be completed is the environmental assessment. The environmental assessment has to be completed and submitted to the FTA for approval. And some type of resolution or some type of document specifically spelling out what that match will be and the source of that match is required prior to the award of that grant. So the two key elements, the environmental assessment and then a commitment for the match, have to be made prior to anyone gaining access to that grant. Once that grant is provided access to, since HART is the direct recipient of it, all invoices, all financial and accounting processes have to be flowed through HART. So there's still a series of events that have to occur. The county is very much aware of what those requirements are and are actively working on the environmental component.
And Jeff, just stepping through the environmental program, as we understood from FTA last week, that could be a 2-year process.
Yes.
They expect significant work. They had also noted that the difference between repurposing an existing dock and replacing a brand new dock.
Totally different.
So any, their term was, once you start driving pylons, things are fundamentally different for them. So all the environmental work being done by the private partner and the county must be completed, submitted to the FTA for review and approval. And that happens before the award would happen. And there also is the issue of the county match. The grant award just stated that Hillsborough County was responsible for the match. They did not specify funds or in-kind time which is being used for it. And the county match at this point is $9 million, is what was put into the application. The grant, of course, is for approximately $4.8 million, and then that leaves an unfunded portion of 4.7 to 4.8, and the county has the opportunity with their partner to come up with ways to fill that. But again, they will be doing the environmental work. Once that gets done, then the paperwork process can start to put the grant application in the FTA system. It also has to be included in the State Transportation Improvement Program prior to FTA making the award. So we're 2 years off from that being a possibility.
You want to recap those numbers?
Yes, ma'am. The original request for the grant application was for a project of about $24 million. And they scaled down the grant application to cover about an $18 million project. The request was from the feds to do 55% of the grant, which was just over $9 million. And the county response would have then been about $7.8 million. The feds came back with half the request, which was 27% of the price tag of the grant as pulled together. So the federal grant is about 4.78, around 4.8, okay. About between 4.7 and $4.8 million. The county requirement is about $8 million. And then the last portion of the remaining 4.7, 4.8, the county has opportunities to match with their partnership, essentially in any way that is accepted. The county must outline where their $7 to $8 million match is coming from and show that they are good for it before the grant can proceed with the FTA.
Now, does this money include the ancillary requirements, parking lots, etc.?
It's pretty expansive. It doesn't include park and ride locations. It included, at least identified the people mover system, which will be put over at McDill as a different level of contribution. It includes all the planning work. It includes the vehicles, I want to say, because that's a private contribution. So it's, let's pull the page from the grant application and also send that out as I have a partner weekly this week so we can show exactly what the grant application included financially and what the county was on, had committed to, and what the partner had committed to. Again, HART is, we are the grantee, so the funding comes through us, but we are at this point, the grant is tied back to HART having a financial commitment beyond administering the grant through our procurement process.
Well, where do we pick up the 6 million? If the feds are giving 4.8 and the county's putting in 8, that's 12.8. How do you update me?
I'm not sure where the county is looking for those funds. They mentioned last week that they were looking for different options. They understand that for the matching portion, the 8 million, that they couldn't use federal funds, but that for their delta, that 6 million, they have the opportunity to look for other funds. And again, the grant is coming to HART, but since it is a county project with a private partner, they'll be the ones looking for where their match comes, not just their match, but that additional money. They'll be identifying those options.
Those numbers are a little different than what the county is showing in their news data that's going out to public hearings, and it's in, I think, their video. I think that references 26 million, not 24. And I know there's issues of who has what, and it's not all that far along. But it's sufficiently confusing that at some point this is kind of floated around quite a while now. It seems to be getting further away. It's getting closer, and anyway, we need to disappointed to think it's going to take 2 years just to get the grant on.
Well, and again, we'll go ahead and pull the exact page from the grant application because those are the numbers that the FTA is holding all of us to. So again, it's passing through HART, but they're holding the county's partner to the numbers in that grant application. So we'll get that out to everyone and to the full board. So that's the best that we can refer to.
And the operating fund will be totally from the vendor?
The intent, as I understand, for the project right now is the vendor completely covers operating costs in the first 5 years. And we again have cautioned them that in year 6, if they have, for them to remember the FTA funds built something that has a useful life past the first 5 years, that facility must stay in operation. So for them just to be aware, if it's a 10-year dock, then it needs to have a 10-year ferry service. Unlike a streetcar or a bus that we can rotate to another transit partner, we can't just take the dock and give it to somebody else. It would be difficult to do that. So we're just making sure that they understand those constraints that kick in once we start using federal funds.
I mean, that takes some strategy in terms of the assets that should be procured with federal dollars that might be far more prudent to purchase vehicles, for example, and non-fixed assets and have those be account managers. Those can have other purposes beyond transit and et cetera. I know there's been a fair amount of energy that's thinking about this.
Those are our decisions to make.
Hard to know. The community needs to come together on how and when, and what's the logic. I mean, there's a host of issues of if this is going to be a transit service, a traditional, it's counted with our ridership and uses our passes and those kinds of things, and counts towards our formula grants. That's a little different than other things, and is that what this is, and how does it all play out in terms of who's got what degrees of control, and et cetera. It's, all of the Title 6, the air transit services, the fare stuff, all needs to be thought through in terms of, is this a traditional transit project and investment or not? And even the issues of, the assets and how long we utilized. At one point, there was at least some discussion of this as an experiment, and we'll try it for 5 years, and if it works, great. And if it doesn't, we sell the boats and, repurpose the dock as a marina, and, have at it, but like I said, that just needs to be thought through carefully.
Pulling this discussion back into the TDP, you mentioned that this is not part of the TDP, and I assume we're not seeking any state dollars. So, but in the future, if this project goes forward, is this something that does roll into the TDP, at least as far as the reporting aspects?
Yes and no. Since we're tying the TDP to the budget process, it will be part of the budget. As far as the service, if there is adjoining service or connectivity to park and rides that are connected to the ferry service, that will indeed be incorporated into the TDP, but not the operational component of the ferry itself, if I understand the process.
So as far as like reporting discrepancies and how you performed, you wouldn't necessarily give them that detail, but in the overall numbers.
Not in the TDP, but as far as the federal audits, such as FMOs and triennials, we will absolutely be on the hook for that $4.7 million utilization.
Right.
So,
Wouldn't this be very similar to our relationship with the street traffic?
Yes.
We own it, but we don't own it, we're responsible, but we aren't. But if anything goes wrong, we owe the feds.
We will not own anything, we will not own anything in this case, but your last statement, if anything happens with the grant, we are the grantee, it's our responsibility to keep that in mind. We are the ones ultimately on the hook for the appropriate expenditure of these funds.
Okay, any more comments on the TDP discussion? No, thank you very much, Mr. Sewer. Very enlightening. The next item on our agenda is the Operations Division Key Performance Indicators, and Ricky Reyes.
Good evening, everyone.
Make sure you keep the microphone close to you. There you go.
Try right now. Thank you. Okay, my voice is there. Okay, good morning. So in our previous meeting, we discussed our operations KPIs, and today we're coming to talk to you about the operations and overall targets for next year. And in the ridership productivity in particular, you'll see that in 2014, we were at greater than or equal to 24 bus passengers per revenue hour, and in 2015, we were looking at greater than or equal to 23.5 passengers per revenue hour. And that's just a marginal decrease in what we're measuring. And, Jeff mentioned in the previous presentation that ridership has sort of plateaued. And we're seeing that over the last few months that the ridership hasn't increased. And some of that is what we're looking at in 15 are marginal changes, about 19,000 hours, but they're not likely to increase the productivity in ridership. So we're looking at just a small indicator going down. And in the quality of service goals, which is complaints per 100,000 passengers. In 14, we looked at 11, less than or equal to 11.5, and in 15, we're looking at 13. And I'll bring a graph in a few slides for you to show you where we've been trending. And of course, in the mean distance between failure and bus maintenance, greater than or equal to 6,800, and we're just marginally under that goal this year. We're looking at resetting the goal in 15 to greater than or equal to 6,600. Our on-time performance, however, we raised the bar this year. We're looking to raise the bar next year. We've been trending at or about 74%, and we're looking to increase the goal in 15 from 72% to greater than or equal to 74% in 15. And the finance, efficiency, and safety goals, we're looking to remain the same, to keep the bar the same in 15.
Could I ask a very slightly more question? Why are we lowering goals for this coming year?
The vehicular goals, as the fleet has gotten older, it's become more challenging for us to make sure that we're hitting some of these benchmarks for miles between failures. And these are not small failures like,
No, I'm starting at the top, yeah.
okay, starting at the top.
Yeah, why are we lowering our expectation on ridership productivity? If I understand what that means.
And we have been tracking anywhere from 22 to 24 passengers per revenue hour. And just with our, we're adding a little bit more service, but the service we're adding is not in the rush hour. And our rush hour service is where we get the biggest return on our investment. Those are where we're most likely to hit these high metrics. So since we cannot add rush hour, we're starting to see folks migrating away from those times. They're just not able to keep up with the growth that we've had in the previous years of hitting this at 24 passengers per revenue hour.
It's not like we're getting less riders. The challenge to transit is when you add service, arguably by definition, you're adding it in a less optimal time because the existing service is by design in your best places and at your best times. So as you expand, you're moving into the more marginal markets by definition. So historically, elasticity to service applies about 40%. In other words, if you increase service 10%, you'll roughly get a 4% increase in ridership. That's close to an industry norm. And particularly where you're trying to do things like, let people get home from a second shift and have decent service on the weekends and stuff, those aren't going to be productive services. They're important social services, but they're not high-volume transit services. And so it's always a challenge when you expand service to retain your productivity, and you have to hope that there's enough synergy that you can attract more people, and that over time that balances out. One of the things that HART's done exceptionally well is expand ridership faster than service, unlike the rest of the industry. And the challenge is when you start to grow, particularly if you grow aggressively, it's hard to have the market keep up with it unless you're seeing some, real significant intensification of land use or some other things that enhance your market opportunities. I'm similarly disappointed that we're dropping our goal. I don't think it's unrealistic to expect some dampening in productivity as you expand into off-peak periods. I don't like lowering the bar. I just don't think it's a healthy strategy. I realize we don't want to get unrealistic in terms of setting goals nobody can ever hit. But I also think we need to be very careful about backing down from goals.
So does that mean you would like to make some kind of a motion on that?
I would like to, particularly the productivity goal. Costs obviously need to change with inflation. That I'm comfortable with. Productivity, I'd like to see as a goal stay high. The other one I think that changed was customer complaints, and that's not always a bad sign. If customers are calling asking for better service a lot, then there's only so much you can do about it. And the fact that they're interested is a good sign. They're disappointed is a bad sign.
And Ruthie has done an awful lot of research with other peer agencies on who else is using this metric of complaints per passengers. You've got a lot on that, but in a nutshell, you found that not a lot of other places are using this, and they are using it, shall we say, judiciously. So, for instance, Atlanta has the same metric we do, but Atlanta has diplomatically, there's a lot of crime going on that they are reporting differently. They've got assaults happening on their buses, which obviously don't rate. They're not rolling into their complaints because no one complained about it to them other than to the police. So they're just, it's not a very precise measure for us. It's not one we see used throughout the industry. And we're not seeing that we're getting a lot of value out of this particular metric as it is structured today. So Ruthie has a conversation on some way that we'd like to keep this, but some other stuff we'd like to do to make sure we're really getting to what is customer satisfaction versus just looking at how many complaints per passengers. And again, this translates out to one complaint per every 500 or 5,000 passengers.
It's probably short. Great news.
It's equivalent of 2,000 complaints over the year for 15 million passenger trips.
Well, that kind of dialogue to me is a lot more meaningful than just having these metrics ready. I mean, if the things you think we need to focus in on as a board, then I'm more than willing to listen, but just listen to numbers where it doesn't really do much for me.
Director Peter?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment that has become more relevant as the discussion has evolved here, and it's just a general comment on KPIs, right? Remember, KPIs are very specific measures, and KPIs often have to be looked at as a total package because you can manipulate any particular KPI, sometimes to the detriment of others. Sometimes if you don't design your package correctly, right, you can manipulate a KPI and have unintended consequences to the negative that aren't reflected. So I do think, as Ms. Davin pointed out, a broader discussion at some point about the KPI package and the interrelationships and how they relate to the goals will go a long ways towards sort of, I think, easing our reaction to the numbers when they're put on the board, right? Because again, designing a KPI package that can show an increase in any particular number in any particular year without actually making a better product or better service can be done, right? And that's just manipulating the KPI. So I think focusing on the package and how they tie to objectives at some point would probably go a long ways towards easing the discussion about the particular numbers and the increments that we're looking at.
Now, there were a couple that were up and a couple that were down. In addition to that, the way they're used, particularly as it relates to, employee reviews and performance and et cetera, is important to understand. I mean, you don't want to set high goals that nobody can ever reach, and therefore it's showing up as negative reviews when folks are doing everything they can. And so it needs to be thought through carefully.
KPIs are best practice, by the way, so this is great that we do them at all, but to the extent that we do dig into them, they're better taken as a package and really looking at how the KPIs are set up and what you're trying to achieve than the incremental number on an annual basis.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. And so what we looked at in operations specifically was our on-site performance, the complaints per 100,000, and the mean distance between failure. And we showed this at our last presentation. Our target was 72%, and we are in a bad year. We're about averaging 74%, and in July we saw even raised that to 78%. And so to that end, we're looking at raising that bar to the 74% for FY15. And this is what we look like through the years as we've been trending upward in this area.
Can we go back to the chart? Just to note from the budget, bar chart. Thank you. To note from the budget presentation, Jeff had stressed that from fiscal 9 to fiscal 13, we saw a 25% increase in ridership, and this is in a window where we had a contraction in service on the street. So we were able to increase on-time performance as an agency, even though we had a substantial influx of passengers and we did not have additional vehicles out there. So this is an example of a metric that tells a good story, but it's a story that needs more explanation.
One comment on this one that's particularly relevant is we, the country's had a flattening, in fact, a decline in overall roadway travel for several years. And that's a huge factor here in transit, both productivity and on-time performance. And if the economy gets more robust and or population growth is such that we start to see increasing overall traffic, then it'll be a lot more challenging to maintain these levels. I mean, the flattening of traffic growth and the decline in some places is really going to benefit to those. And that'll put pressure on schedules and costs and everything else that we've really avoided for the last decade because travel demand has been flat to down. And Florida was down last year in spite of the rebounding economy. Global travel in the state was down still.
And I see a big jump from 2013 to 2014. I wonder if that had maybe some of the contributing factors might have been the fact that we realigned added service to Route 31, one of our highest routes, and then also the Metro Rapid, providing more, less crowded routes.
And so those are some of the things that increased our on-time performance, including that our service development team and operations staff closely looked at the routes individually and and down to the operator level, and even posting those performance metrics out there for the operators to sort of measure themselves from month to month, see how they're doing, and have those individual conversations with the operators to say, hey, you know, we see this is happening. Is it to the route? Is it something happening at that time of the day? Could we tweak the route and the service schedule some? Or is it at the operator level? Does he need some assistance in his performance? And the complaints for 100,000. And so we were measuring in FY14, 11.5 per 100,000. And it's the top complaint categories, lates and pass-bys. And of course, we do some investigation and mitigation in those. And in the measure over the year, we've been trending about the same as 13 and 14, somewhere about 13 or 13 and a half complaints per 100,000. And this is somewhere where we've stayed within that range for the last 2 years, and we have not met the goal over the last several years. And then in our pass-by complaints, which is the most common complaint, I apologize, let me just go back one. We saw 371 of those year to date, and 38 of those were in June. Were pass-by complaints, and of course we looked at to the stop level, and Commissioner Miller asked us to take a look at by route and what it looked like comparison to the ridership. And so we added that for your review here, and you can see that the numbers look, the charts look tremendously high, but when you look at what the number of complaints, for example, on Route 36, you have 4 complaints, but the ridership is near 80,000. So it's relative when you look at it from the perspective of the ridership per route to see what the number of complaints were. And that it's a small measure. It doesn't disregard the fact that we maybe have left someone behind, but when we go back and look at what happened at that time, we look at video, we look at the on-time performance, we look at the ORPAT system, the ITS, maybe there was a detour, or maybe the bus was not even in service and heading back to the garage, or a mechanic has taken it out to test the vehicle. And or there's still the other issue where they're sitting at the Metro Rapid stop and waiting on the Route 2 and they're disconnecting on Route 7.
That didn't stop me, it wasn't concerned.
Just, if this is a new chart for me.
Yes.
So what kind of takeaway here from Route 1, which seems, am I saying that Route 1 is the blue?
The Route 1 had one failure to pick up for over 80,000, almost 100,000 miles.
Okay, so it's
One particular complaint in that month in
okay.
June.
So it's better to see the smaller blue to the
The blue are the number of complaints, and we can rechart those as actually a line, so it'll stand out. The blue are the numbers of complaints, and the pinky red color is the ridership. So in Route 1, in the month of June, and again, this is who calls in, there was one complaint for failure to pick up, and that route carried over 90,000 individual passenger trips.
Okay. So if I were to point out where the kind of the worse are performing, and I don't know if 4 complaints is worse, but it has a much smaller ridership. So Route 36 would be the one that you would maybe focus on first. Is that what I'm thinking?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
And so our late complaints, we had 254 late complaints in the year to date, and that's through June, and of course 26 of those were in June. Particularly overall for June was 200 complaints, and some of that is about the schedule, some of that is about the folks that are missing those connections. Sometimes we're on detour and we're running a little behind schedule, and sometimes folks are also anticipating making a connection that, quite frankly, the 2 routes are not scheduled to meet. Not every route can make a connection at every transit center. So when we serve a north-south route, we don't always make the connection at both EOLs, both ends of the line. And so for some customers, that makes them appear late. And so when you look at the comparison to the late complaint versus the ridership, it's a very small number compared to the ridership per route. And then our mean distance between failures. We are targeting greater than or equal to an FY14 to 6,800 miles between failures, and we're just marginally under that number at 6778. And if we have a banner summer, if you will, through the end of September, we may actually meet that goal. So we're not entirely sure that we may not meet that, but it has been a tough, hot summer, so we may not meet it, I don't know.
Well, and coming back to what Director Crino said, if you relate this to the age of the fleet,
Correct.
it's an entirely different situation.
And you definitely see that from 12 to 13, because in 12, we had a very young fleet, and we had run into some emissions issues from our 2010 purchases. It didn't start popping up until the vehicles were 3 or 4 years old, and seals were wearing out, and filters had to be replaced a little more frequently. So we had really a fantastic 12 as an outlier, but in this perspective, it certainly looks like we haven't been able to keep up, when it's really that those young vehicles gave us a really fantastic set of 3 years.
Thank you.
And some of the things that have caused us to have some of those failures between miles is, the engines that are old need to be replaced, transmissions need to be replaced, and a lot of this work is being done in 15, including 47 engines and transmissions that are part of our SLEP, or SLEP, as we would say, our System Life Extension Program for the buses. And so the age of the fleet is going to average in FY15 somewhere is about 8 years old. And so that's partly the reason why we're also looking at lowering that goal to 6,600, because we understand that even though we have 22 new CNG buses coming into the fleet in 15, we won't see those until later in the year is one. And we do have the major components of work that we need to work throughout the rest of the year. And so, of course, we're doing the aging on purpose, and we're looking also at the additional positions to help support all of that work we have to do in 15. And hopefully that will get us through that process. And then some of the things that we looked at recently were some of the benchmarks. What are other agencies looking at? Many of them are doing some of the same indices that we are, in the complaints, on-time performance, and finance indicators, and safety. However, their criteria maybe differs from ours. And some of that wasn't readily available, and we'd like to bring that back to the board at a later time. Because what we measure, and per se what they measure, would be two different things, even though they may be looking at complaints or mean distance or safety.
And Ruthie, I think it's fair to say in your research that there was a surprising dearth of publicly available KCI data. A lot of agencies will say what they measure, but trying to find on their website what the actual measure is was challenging. And making phone calls, it's been a big exercise of we'll forward that on to the next person and come back to you. So seeing where we stand on these particular measures is still a little challenging.
Well, another thing, I noticed you marked Chicago here, and that to me isn't very realistic. First of all, look at their weather problems. That throws any comparison of the two agencies out as far as I'm concerned. And their population and the size of their fleet. I mean, there's no sense of us really benchmarking ourselves to them.
Our bus director came to us from Chicago, so we had a lot of contacts back there. And that was one of the reasons we went, was we figured if we knew folks, we were more likely to get information. But those are good observations. And what we'll do is we'll add San Diego, Santa Clara, comparable, more comparable size-wise and weather-wise, and see if we can get to anyone. I know somebody over in Riverside, so we should be able to get some information.
And so our recommendations, well, beyond looking at specifically our customer satisfaction program, maybe we capture it on an ongoing basis, the satisfaction of our service, meeting the needs of our customers and exceeding those customer needs as well. And maybe a focus group of core staff to evaluate the KPIs quarterly, so we're not just reporting them to you, but taking some active measures on a quarterly basis to see how we can improve and exceed those goals from quarter to quarter. And define the target resource, develop those strategies and mitigate the issues as we go along throughout the year, rather than just merely reporting numbers back to you at the end of the year. And then, look at our customer satisfaction measures. Beyond just what we receive in terms of complaints or comments from our customers, are they using social media? Are they satisfied with our mobile apps? Has their website accomplished or met their needs, and are they able to be used with ease? and our responsiveness, if you will, to those complaints. It's not just that we receive your comments, but how we're responding back to our customer. And those are the things that we're looking at in the next year in terms of these KPIs. Any other
Could
questions?
I make a suggestion? Could I suggest that you present this to the full board and might consider going through all the backup information first and then suggesting whatever changes you want to suggest with the standards? Because it's more helpful and more understandable if you hear the details first and then look at the number.
Sure. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Otherwise, I think you'll have exactly the same kind of conversation.
The questions important that would have been answered probably.
Exactly.
Yeah. I was just, did anybody have a comment? One of the things that I had made mentioned in Ms. Egan was, as far as cost, I mean, and it goes kind of with hand in hand with what Director Pino was talking about, tying in our goals and our missions with some of the KPI. And one of our goals obviously is financial sustainability. To me, it's kind of a nebulous number to wrap my hands around what the gross cost of revenue mile actually means. But I would see tracking a cost per trip as something that would make more sense to me. Now, I don't know if that necessarily has to be in the KPI, but it might be something to consider reporting in some other fashion, if not in the KPI.
Sure.
And I think where this really becomes pivotal for our agency is if we do seek federal dollars. I mean, in that ACOM report, it basically updated the alternatives analysis and the fact that none of the alternatives met the threshold of being below $999 a trip. You know, so if we kind of keep that at the forefront, and I think we're doing really well actually currently as far as that goes, but it would be a nice statistics maybe to see monthly reported to us or some way, if not within the KPI.
Well, and the benefit of that too is if we'd like to do comparison data, that we can pull directly from the National Transit Database. It won't be fresh to this year, so you'll have 14 data for us and potentially 11 or 12 data for comparator agencies. But then we aren't in the situation of calling them and finding out how do you consider yourselves late, how are you measuring it. So it becomes a more objective way to measure our performance against what the industry is doing to see how we're lining up. So we're working on that.
Yeah, I think your reference to NTD is important. The measures here that have NTD components, you might want to at least flag those. That data is available. I mean, Cutter does an annual report for all of the properties in Florida that comes out late every year. That's for the preceding years. So I mean, there is comprehensive data based on the MTD data sets for all Florida and all the rest of the country that lags a little bit further time-wise in terms of when that's released. In terms of overall trend, you've loosened 3 standards and tightened 1. I'd like to see the ridership productivity stay where it's at. The efficiency one, there's a strong basis for arguing that should be adjusted with at least inflation, and even if we beat it, that's okay. But I think there's a kind of a compelling case that obviously core inflation, and if we can sustain lower levels, that's good. But as opposed to some year when you need to do a big jump just to move it back to where it belongs, I'd be inclined to take that up with a CPI number. And then again, I think, rather than call agencies, and I know for certain things like on-time performance, there's not good national standardized data, but some of these there are standardized industry data, so you can get that data from off the web basically, so for comparisons. I would move that we make those modifications and pass it on to the full board and then embrace the changes in discussion to reflect Fran's suggestions with a little bit more of what's the purpose of these things and then go to the numbers.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the issue? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, pass unanimously. Okay, that concludes the presentation portion. Thank you, really appreciate that great presentation. We have 5 action items. Has everyone had a chance to review them? And if anyone would like to pull one, otherwise I entertain a motion to accept all.
Move 3A through E.
Exactly. You just approved E in a different form. I think you take that separately and approve A, B,
Gotcha,
C,
okay.
and D as they are.
Yeah.
Move A through D.
A through D. Seconded, okay. Any discussion on that before we vote? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That's unanimous. And that, I don't see anything else on the agenda.
No, we should move E, but with the modifications, as like you suggested.
Well, was that in your motion?
Well, okay, you're right, that is implicit, yeah.
I would have ordered it.
I get it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That concludes our